So I'm now pleased. Let's turn to the subcommittee report outs. I'm pleased to introduce Stu Pan now. Stu and I were having a little exchange. Each of our subcommittee chairs has an extraordinary background that makes them well suited to lead each of these committees. We've included their bios in the past. And so, rather than me read a whole page of information that we've already shared, we'll just dive right in. Suffice to say, though, that Stu has led businesses and operations in the semiconductor industry for 40 years, and we're delighted that he's our subcommittee chair for data, innovation, and technology. Stu, thanks for taking over the leadership of the subcommittee alongside your day job, which now is helping to rebuild America's onshore semiconductor production capabilities. Stu?
Thanks, Jeff. Tom, if you go ahead and bring up the slides, please. So just wanted to start out by first off thanking all of the committee members. I won't read them all off by name. I think we've had an interesting process over the last year or so, storming, norming, forming, debating, and I really appreciate their work along with, next slide, please, Tom. Along with Hal Lee, who had the chair of this committee before I did. Hal gave us a great foundation to work with, and I think one of the things I really have enjoyed about this committee is it's a wide variety of folks and a wide variety of industries. And I know, having grown up in the semiconductor industry, I tend to have blinders on my 40 years worth of history. And I appreciate everybody reminding me there are things outside of semiconductors, despite what you may think from COVID. So once again, thank you for all that. And thank you to the staff for educating me about what FACA really is. I didn't quite know when I took this assignment. I now have a much finer appreciation of the rules, and Grant, you'll be pleased to see some of the things you've been asking about. We'll actually see in the next couple of slides. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We've had several meetings, May 3rd, May 31st, July 6th, August 3rd, August 11th. We've been building momentum around really a series of 5 recommendations. We've iterated, we've had some ideas that have gone off into the cutting room floor. And today, what we're going to do is review those 5 recommendations, invite the committee's direction on taking those forwards to the secretary, and looking forward to getting further ideas from all of you this afternoon as we talk through this. We clearly don't have any sort of monopoly on good ideas. I've taken a number of notes throughout the presentations already, things I'd like to raise up with the subcommittee in our coming meetings. So with that, let's move into what those 5 recommendations are. First off, Grant, your other question, we do think there's a need to develop a manufacturing data platform, and I'll walk us through what that means. There's been some great work done by the True Demand Initiative, done by Lynn Terrell, who's the Chief Supply Chain Officer of Flextronics. And I want to build on some of the things that she's talked about, because I think they're instructive for us as a team as we try and focus in on solving a particular problem and then seeing if it's extensible. We have talked about as a team the IPEF framework. We have just a request for interview, as I mentioned earlier, to come in and talk to us. I'll walk you through some of the reasons as to why that's so, especially as we're trying to make the semiconductor supply chain and overall electronic supply chain much more resilient. And clearly, IPEF is a major focus of these companies. As we've talked about and gotten feedback from a number of the committee members, we think there's a need for Commerce to convene a summit on future best practices and data sharing. So, Grant, that goes to exactly the thing you just asked about, which is we think that's necessary. There are so many different initiatives going on today that we really need to convene a summit and figure out what can we use as a common platform, what is extensible, and what needs to be unique. I think only by convening a summit handled really by Commerce, which has visibility in all these different areas, that we can get some really good output out of that. 20 days by ocean, obviously getting every shipment in 20 days by ocean is what some people would call a big, hairy, audacious goal, or a BHAG kind of goal. But I think what it does is it puts focus on what is the theoretical limiters? How fast can we do this? How fast can we get stuff through customs on a ship, drayage back off a ship, and really take a look at, can we get this down to as a short time as possible? We're all interested in using clean energy to transport goods, especially across the oceans. And only by doing this can we move stuff away from air and onto boats where it's much more energy efficient. So we think this is a good thing for us to focus on as a team, and requires a lot of data sharing in order to do that. And then lastly, one of the things that probably we haven't, I think, spent enough time about is talking about what are rules of origin, what are tariff programs, what are additions of value, because the rules that come forth on country of origin dramatically affect supply chains to the point that we have to do what was euphemistically called tariff engineering to figure out what's the best place to do country of origin, which may not exactly match what you need to do to build a resilient supply chain. So we're going to put forth a couple of comments on that. So with that, let's move to the next slide, please. And by the way, this is in the paper that we've published out to the committee for just a general overview and hopefully concurrence. I think many of us who've been in supply chain for a couple of decades were all schooled on Howley's seminal paper on the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect is one of these universal truths that we see year in and year out in different industries. And clearly we saw this during the pandemic, where distortions led to markets in consumer goods, but also led to shortages in electronics. And we saw this dramatically have impacts throughout the electronic supply chain, where, for example, the ability to get programmable logic devices, simple devices that implement a series of electronic functions in, say, a microwave, a TV, a car, these were the kinds of things that were super short. And during COVID, we saw brokers literally ask for 1,000% markup on these kind of components. Why? Because we didn't really understand what was going on, and we didn't plan this all the way through. And we think there's a couple of things that we need to do here to go address that. One, manufacturing data platforms not only have to look at backlog and inventory and demand, there also needs to be some sense of provenance. Where do these components come from? And you have to go all the way through the supply chain to figure this out. Now, I'll just share for a few minutes a quick story on what happened during COVID for these things called programmable logic devices. When you go ahead and go through the 5 whys of trying to debug why is something short, what we found out as, and Intel was sort of in the heart of the storm of this, is we build these programmable logic devices along with our competitor AMD, is that what was being shorted were the tools to build these logic devices. And only by doing forensic supply chain accounting were we able to realize that when you went through the entire supply chain, looked at where the components were shipped to, what boards were they put on, what systems were they shipped to, what we found out is the major equipment suppliers in the semiconductor industry couldn't get enough programmable logic devices to build the tools by which we could remove the constraint in the supply chain industry. And only by going through provenance and only by going through, if you will, forensic supply chain diagnosis, could we have figured that out. Now, we subsequently changed our allocation strategies to take care of those tool manufacturers first. And that's one of the reasons why the semiconductor shortage abated. It's only because doing that work. So if we can create data standards, if we can create manufacturing data platforms where we are more open to sharing the provenance of where these components go through, we can then find out where the constraints lie. And some of the biggest constraints were in small, medium businesses that were building servo boards for the diagnostic systems for semiconductor manufacturing. So, it's a connected world that we live in. And I think by creating this manufacturing data platform being talked about in True Demand, we can figure out what are the minimal data elements for manufacturers and suppliers to share, including legal mechanisms that we talked about earlier. What are the analytical engines we need to do? Because candidly, as a supplier into this industry, and my good friend and colleague Ernest Nichols is also on this call with us, we want to make sure that by creating these indicators and these systems, we don't fuel a commodity exchange and inflation in a broker market. And that's one of our biggest fears in creating this platform, is making sure we don't allow the opportunity for arbitrage. So anonymizing the data, figuring out who gets the data, who gets to use it, and making sure the data isn't being taken advantage of, because the minute we find that there's arbitrage created by these things, people will back away. So I think one of the things that we're advocating in terms of True Demand is, let us go off as an industry and experiment. Let's figure out what works, take some small experiments, some small areas where we can cooperate, and see if it's extensible and use that as a learning exercise to broaden not only with the electronics industry, but also other industries at large. Because I think only by doing these experiments can we get the learning we need, and we're not trying to do a boil the ocean kind of problem. So we're advocating that, we're pushing that. We think that could be part of this convening of a summit. Let's figure out how to go do this together and create the right legal environments, the right initiatives, the right privacy. And we've had Lynn Terrell and her team come in and talk to us before. I think there's a lot more to do there in this effort. So we're pretty excited about this possibility, and we're going to continue to pursue this if we get good feedback on this today. Next slide, please. On the IPEF partnership, it's super important right now. The PC industry today, as an example, 90% of the world's notebooks are produced in China. And one of the things we learned during COVID was, sometimes, there can be government decisions based, on, perhaps sound public policy, but shut down supply chains. The industry is going to move to the IPEF countries as part of getting a resilient supply chain. We just want to make sure that we're partnering with you. We are creating our own incentive structures, our own convening of conversations, and it would be good to come in and just brief not only the folks representing the electronics industry in this business, but also the other constituents we have in the data subcommittee. There are things that are hugely important in doing this. For example, when there was a flood in Thailand many years ago, it took out the hard disk drive capability of the PC industry. And that was a very scary time for us, 20 years ago. So we need to, just because we're moving there, doesn't mean we don't have to worry about resiliency. We have to worry about resiliency across the supply chain. I think you're going to find, at least the electronics community is very anxious in working with the IPEF countries, including India, to go create that. But it took a lot of investment on the part of the Chinese government to create these centers of excellence throughout China. And we're going to need help to go bring that out, to bring the learning, to bring the incentives, to bring the data, and understanding how do we build this and scale it, because we need to build this a lot faster than the 10, 20 years it took to build this in China. So ways we can cooperate with IPEF, bring that to industry through these forums, I think would be very, very helpful. You go to the next slide, please. To your question, Grant, this is convening this summit is, I think, exactly what you were looking for. We'd already written this before you and I had talked a few days ago. There are so many things going on in the government today. And I know, as I was being educated by members of our task force about flow, about true demand, about the stuff that the ILW has already got in place for custom support. I think getting this all together, public and private sectors, new developments, data sharing, where are the gaps, what are the standards, how do we go about doing this? And this is going to play into one of our other recommendations coming up in the next few slides, but we just need to figure out how do we take advantage of all this stuff, this idea of, getting 20 days, door to door on custom shipments, that could be part of it. Some of the stuff being already done by the maritime team, that could be part of it. So I think Commerce's unique view across all these initiatives and how we building together in a fashion that industry can understand and participate would be hugely helpful to us. As part of the work we're doing on data. If we could go to the next one, please. So 20 days by ocean. I think this is one, we just have to figure out what's possible, and really start with, the classic manufacturing Pareto's that, Jeff and I and Ursula all grew up on, right? What's your top constraint? Work your way down the Pareto, keep working your way down. And this is, perhaps where government could help us with funding on, creating, AI capabilities, machine learning, robotics facilities, working with the ILUW and figure out how do we help make the ports, more productive, to make their work more rewarding, to get faster throughput times. And I think by giving it a practical framework with a goal, 20 days by ocean, and getting us to think about the problem that way holistically, and building a wide, ranging Pareto of what are the key contributors. This is, I think, hugely important to companies, especially as we're looking at our footprint of transportation. Intel, we have high weight to value, but in the PC industry, there is huge carbon footprint savings if we could move more by boat rather than moving it by air. So help here, I think, could be really useful. And I think convening this kind of effort with stakeholders from labor, business, trade partners early on to shape this would be very helpful, not just for improvements at U.S. ports, but also inland, in other areas where the U.S. could help contribute. So food for thought on that one. Hopefully the committee finds that worthy of pursuing. And then the final one that I'll add is country of origin. And this is perhaps I'm looking at this perhaps too much from an Intel lens, but how we designate country of origin has huge impacts on trades and customs processing. And, we found, not only, in our work, especially during the Trump administration's tariff facilities, but we had to really go through and think about where do we want to put facilities? How do we want to characterize country of origin? Should it be the last step in the process? Or should it be the step where the highest value added is happening? Today in semiconductors, the steps actually happen at the packaging, which is not the highest value added step of processing. And I think as we face different tariff regimes and a lot of global tension over how to do these things, it's important for us from a data and information point of view is get in front of it and figure out what could the Department of Commerce do to look at current rules governing country of origin across manufacturing processes, figure out how do we do bills of lading and figure out where should the best value added lie in these efforts. And I know some of this work is in Congress right now, but anything that we could do with the DOC in bringing this forward, I think would be very helpful because we're making decisions on where to locate manufacturing plants in part due to country of origin. And that may be somewhat artificial depending on the value add of what we do here. So, it's one of these things that doesn't get a lot of visibility, but I think as we talked about in our subcommittee, we think it might be worth doing. And it could have a dramatic effect on how supply chains are shaped. So with that, those are the things that we're talking about. I think, Ursula, Jeff, from a process point of view, we're ready to take this forward. We've gotten feedback according to the rules that the subcommittee members would like to take this forward. I'd open up the floor to questions, comments, concerns, feedback.
I think that's right, Stu. This is a good opportunity for the broad committee membership to ask questions and get clarification for any of the recommendations proposed by the data subcommittee.
I knew I was going to get a question from Willie. That's great. After you.
Okay, so Stu, this is great and appreciate the work here. And two things. First, when you're thinking about the country of origin thing, I think you're right. That's a very key thing. Traditionally, that's been kind of assigned by value. For example, as you look at like automotive components in USMCA. Okay, are you thinking maybe there's another way of looking at that potentially in terms of impact or something like that? Or I'm just trying to explore what you're thinking. That's the first question. And the other one is because I've been looking at how people have been relocating notebook computer manufacturing. Okay, and how do you think about when you find something where you see the market trend is going the wrong way? I'm thinking specifically here about the LCD flat panel displays, where we're down to like one supplier in Taiwan who's holding on and one supplier in Korea who's left, who's kind of holding on by their fingernails, but you sort of know where the whole industry is going.
Yeah, well, I think so on the LCD panel one, that one isn't so much a country of origin, it is more of a public policy investment strategy on the part of the Chinese government. They have been very forceful in creating the LCD panel industry and taking folks like BOE, who were number 4 or 5 in market share just 5 or 6 years ago, to where they're at today, which is a predominant supplier. And as you correctly say, there are other suppliers barely hanging on. I think that's probably more of a public policy question. Although I think from a data subcommittee point of view, if we start looking at provenance, where do all these things come from? And are we recording their country of origin and their value add? We can see where potentially, and Grant, maybe this is one of the things we talk about, where distortions are coming from. Because we've seen, as running supply chain for HP for a number of years, we saw this trend every year increase on the part of China. And they were giving great products, right? Great products, low cost. But I think picking up these trends as part of provenance and country of origin would be a useful diagnostic tool in public policy. So that might be one area that we could look at.
I think to that point, it would be very useful headlights, right? Especially to the extent you can say, I can now make a projection of where this is going, right? So if you kind of compare this over, compare the trend lines over 5-10 years, because that trend has been in the making for 10 years. That could be a very important strategic tool.
Yeah, I've never thought about it. I think that's a great suggestion, and we need to follow up on that because it is a great diagnostic tool. If you combine two things that have to be reported, in terms of country of origin. I think the other thing about country of origin, to your auto example, the rules, I think, from my perspective, and I'm not authority on this, is they feel a bit capricious in terms of what is country, how do you really figure out what is the last value point? And, in the case of semiconductors, the highest value add is in the semiconductor manufacturing facility. It's not in the packaging facility, but yet our parts are stamped made in Malaysia, not made in Arizona. So we should, I think, get credit for putting the vast amount of value of these products in the country in which they're produced. And I think that's something worth looking at, just even from a public policy point of view.
But isn't a lot of that intimately intertwined with, sorry to say this, tax and value allocation?
It is. But these are all tools that if we have report out, I think we need to spend more time on this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a lot of interplay in there, which is very complex. And if you can sort it out, you will get a gold medal.
Yeah, hopefully. I'd be happy with a happy subcommittee, but next question, please.
Yeah, Pam.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a really interesting area, and I'm super excited you're looking at it. And I agree that provenance is super hard to detect. I agree supply chains are within the firm's domain, but I also believe that anytime you're crossing a sovereign boundary, that's in the government's domain. So working together is a great step. But we're looking at small and medium businesses have a really hard time mapping their supply chain networks. It makes it difficult for them to comply with any kind of legislation, like the California Transparency Act and things like that. Right. So any kind of data that the government can share on other countries, to give free access to some other types of businesses outside the target ones for the all the current interest would be helpful. And I agree that value is biased when you're talking about low labor countries. There are, you can assemble it in a country where it's maybe not supposed to be manufactured because of certain practices, and then ship it to a low labor country, have it disassembled and then reassembled. So how do you get those multiple tiers shared? And then I guess my question is, I've heard of this request from a couple dozen companies to try to make import data more hidden, such a bill of ladings and such like that. And I just wondered if your subcommittee kind of works with these other agencies to try to stop things like that, or if you've heard of it. And I'll put my hand down.
No, in that particular area, we have not had that discussion. And I invite the other subcommittees members who may be more familiar with it to comment on, but it's something we certainly could explore. and have discussions on it. I want to make sure our committee work isn't dominated by big company thinking. And that's a good reminder of that. So, we'll certainly bring that up in another committee meeting and figure out how do we address the needs of small and medium business in this data sharing area.
Michael?
Mike?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to mention one small thing in this package of recommendations that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. It's part of
Sure.
number 5 on modernization. We included some language in there about removing paper processes from the border clearance operations. And members of my association, the express companies, estimate that they provide over 1 million pieces of paper to the US government in a year. I mean, there's an environmental issue in here, I think, but that's just one aspect of this. If these recommendations go up the line, if we wanted a place to start and kind of parse these out, where we'd start taking it in smaller bites, that's a bite that I hope we could take on toward the front of the effort.
Great.
Thanks very much.
That's a very appetizing bite. Thank you for that suggestion.
Rick?
Thank you. And Stu, this is all great. And I think really it supports, this idea of the closest point between 2 points is a straight line, if you will, and handle material the least amount of times. This probably comes from my 20 plus years in the consumer packaged goods food industry on-time delivery, but 20 days by ocean, I think that's a great goal and really important, obviously, in terms of global trade and how companies are going to manage inventory and so on. When we get down to measuring that, we say door to door, obviously if something gets stuck at a port because a connector is bottlenecked or something, it's really not getting to where its destination is, where the goods can do some good, getting to consumers quicker and all that. As we get through that, how many of those points are we going to be looking at? There's one thing port to port, but then there's another point port to some retailer, some place.
Right.
Good.
Yeah, I think right now it's 20 days port to port is pretty aggressive, given where we're at. I think we start there because I don't want to put an impossible Pareto that has cross docks and everything else going through it. But I think port to port is where we start. But I'd love to get feedback from other members, especially the folks who work at our ports day in and day out. What do they see? Where are we losing time? What could we do better there? So that is where we would start, but we clearly need to flesh this out a bit more. Figure out just where are we going to analyze and how are we going to go about doing it.
Yeah.
I think I'm at my time.
You are, and I don't see any other questions. Stu, just one thing I wanted to add. You made a comment about some of the dearth of infrastructure in certain countries that in the IPEF that would probably need to be addressed for more supply chain diversity. We do have this existence proof that firms can move quickly without such build, at least after the fact build. It may have been done beforehand, kind of by accident. But when the tariffs in the prior administration were imposed, I saw a number of textile operations, consumer electronics, certainly not foundries, but right. Complex operations move unbelievably quickly out of China into Southeast Asia. And there may be some interesting case studies there that we can use to figure out how, in addition to, government infusions of infrastructure capital, the market just will take care of some of the stuff.
Yeah, the guys who moved first were the guys who got all the resources, and anybody who thought about it 3 or 4 months later, not so good. But you're right, and I think there are some good cases. It is a first mover advantage in these kind of things. But the question is, how do we make it resilient for everybody? And it's a balancing act, and economics plays a huge role in this. So
great.
Well, thanks, Stu. Thanks, subcommittee, for the work so far. This has been, and thanks to all the input so far. Let's move on. I'd like to turn now to Jean Soroka, call him the veteran in the group. who chairs our subcommittee on freight movement, policy, and infrastructure. Gene?
Thanks, Ursula. Just a couple quick points. One, our subcommittee on freight continues to focus on its 3 areas of recommendation. Investment across federal agencies into the supply chain, resiliency, electrification, hydrogen, et cetera, clean energies, as well as broader infrastructure, including things like truck stops across the nation. Second, it's continued focus on labor, and especially in this sector, good union jobs, how we set up training and curriculum that doesn't take away from investment from private sector companies, but accentuates that positive. And lastly, that focus on exports that's been covered here today. But our conversation over the past several months has been dominated by 2 particular areas. One, how do we speed the cycle time in dialogue with the White House, NEC, Department of Commerce decision policymakers on these recommendations? And secondly, how do we align with the secretary and the agencies, plural, directives, initiatives, and focus areas, right? So what we've learned in these past couple of years since this particular FACA committee has been reconstituted is that we've thrown dozens and dozens of recommendations out. And quite honestly, some of them have gone stale because of the cycle time that lacks in the current construct. So I wanted to put this out to the group, and I know it makes some people bristle, but I want to hear feedback. We've had conversations directly with Nima, with Grant, with Monica. Tremendous dialogue and some very open conversations on where we can move forward and improve. As our job is pretty simple. How do we support Dr. Brainerd, and how do we support the Secretary of Commerce?
And Jean, what conclusions did you reach based on these discussions and the viewpoint on how do we kind of speed the dialogue and the decision on the recommendations?
Yeah, I think real simply, Revathi, is that we've got to have access to the policymakers, some of which have joined us on today's meeting, as opposed to running this through a very archaic system of staff and trying to push it up in organizations. Not to eliminate anyone from this dialogue, but realistically speaking, it's been slow. And we've got to do things a little bit differently. And I think there was recognition of that. But happy to look to the comments of Grant and Nima, who are on the call right now. I think Monica has dropped off.
We're happy to speak to that, though I know that you're throwing it open to other members too. The dialogue that we had in the subcommittee, I thought was incredibly useful. I got the sense from you and others that having a more dynamic exchange, having more speakers on key topics at the subcommittee level, having a more real-time exchange can be quite useful on some topics. We tried to be really thoughtful in signaling our priorities from the Department of Commerce today about some which I think require further study and could be subject to written recommendations or however you think best, and others where we think having an exchange in real time with the key people working on them could be the fastest and most impactful way to do it. So that really is a function of the issue that is being worked, but we're ready, willing, and interested in speeding up and having a more dynamic exchange. And so doing that through the subcommittees and picking these priorities seem like a very sensible way for us.
Great, thanks, Grant.
And Jean, I think that's the same place we landed in our conversation with Grant, and Willie spent a lot of time on this for the manufacturing subcommittee, is that the most kind of effective way probably moving forward would be that there's several big important government priorities and initiatives that is in the works. And the best way for the committee would be to be approached by the people who are spearheading these big priorities, and then for us to give feedback and guidance on that, and advice and our view on it would probably be a good way of interacting moving forward. So, agree with kind of where Grant concluded his statement that we felt like that would be the most productive use too.
Yeah, I would agree also. I think, Grant, you and I talked about this. I think, getting insight from Commerce would be super helpful to the subcommittee chairs and to our committees in general. What are the next steps? How does Commerce glue this all together? I know for one, I'd be happy to continue our conversations on this area and how we can make it better.
If I might jump in here, I think today we have received, and this has been happening, I think, over the last 5 or 6 months, where we've narrowed down the focus of our partners in commerce. The 4 priorities, data standards and protection, IPEF, India specifically, the manufacturing extension partnerships. These overlap with some of the recommendations that have been made by the subcommittees. And, Gene, I would, if I go to the port subcommittee, I think one thing to do is to cross those priorities with the recommendations that we made and make sure that the ones that fall out, where there's, clear overlap, receive the highest priority. And then each of the subcommittees has refined or added, some additional nuance or even some new ideas, like the 20-day on the water, not just on the water, actually 20-day cycle time challenge, which I kind of like those BHAG goals that are like that, especially when you're at 35 days. Some of those are new, and I think it'll be really important to get rapid feedback from the department on how much appetite there is to devote resources to them, and to potentially engage in whatever policy support would be necessary for them to succeed. But Gene, one question for you would be, if you cross the priorities that the Secretary gave us today, with Grant's clarification and the recommendations that the subcommittees already made, what rises to the top?
Well, that's what intrigued me the most, Jeff. Having worked in Asia and the Middle East for 11 years on the ground, and just coming back from Asia last week, the move to IPEF countries, how the agencies can work with private sector and what's needed to bring those trade relationships even closer together, are something that I want to jump into right away from a freight perspective. I alluded briefly to the Secretary about infrastructure in both countries she outlined. I was on the ground in Indonesia for a number of years. It's an archipelago that doesn't usually use land transport, it's water transport across those major areas, which will have an impact on what we recommend as well. And then jumping into the data portion. So yeah, we can kind of take what we've done already, and we've made some pretty vocal statements about our recommendations on previous subcommittee and full committee calls. Now dialing in a little bit to the 3-4 things she mentioned today, quite easy to pivot.
Well, and then I think it's worth, one final scrub, which is what things were not on that list that she mentioned that you just don't want to give up, that you think are too important. I called this out earlier. I think your push, along with Ursula's, for exports was huge, and it led in part to the reconstitution of PEC, which is great. And it fits, frankly, with the, what demand is there in India and the Indo-Pacific region generally for American goods. So that, that push is directly aligned with the recommendation that you made, starting a couple of years ago. But what other ones do you want to make sure get added to Commerce's list? I think that would be super important to make sure we don't drop those.
Yeah, good points, Jeff. And having worked so closely with the administration since Inauguration Day, we still believe that getting money out the door on the IIJA and IRA is absolutely key to success. Second, and we hear it every day, that the president, the administration, the agency is fully supportive of a robust labor and economy that grows from the bottom up and the middle out. And that's been our focus too, inclusive of investing in the ability to train, reskill, and upskill folks as we head into a decarbonized age of transportation. And then the last piece is exports, as you just mentioned. So I think we've put all those out there. If there needs to be more granularity or fine tuning around those three very focused areas of recommendation, super. If not, we'll pivot to these other areas pretty quickly while keeping those recommendations moving forward that we've already submitted. Albeit in draft form, Jeff, as you know from the FACA standpoint, that we've got to get this back to full committee off of a majority vote from the subcommittee.
Right, right. Willie, I'll get to you in just a second, but Grant, I want in particular the labor training item that the Gene and the subcommittee have regularly raised, and this has come up in the other subcommittees as well. It's part of the manufacturing extension partnerships, but I think, and I know this is a priority for the secretary, I think that's one that we ought to add to the list and make sure that the considerable talent and passion about that issue that's assembled here isn't wasted.
Understood. And we've got great interest in doing more on workforce and doing everything that we can, realizing that a lot of the work and the authorities and resources doesn't necessarily lie in commerce, but the secretary is incredibly seized with thinking about how workforce issues relate to our ability to make supply chains more secure and to actually increase domestic manufacturing as a key component of that, including in implementing the CHIPS and Science Act. And so we're ready and able to get more information from this and think about what we can do. Also, as Dr. Brainerd talked about this too, they're working at the NEC with the Department of Labor and thinking about a lot of related issues as well. So we will get with Dr. Gorman and others to follow up.
We shouldn't waste the opportunity to help refine what is a good job with the input from all the folks assembled here. Willie?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like the manufacturing subcommittee put in a lot of recommendations, and just to be helpful, it's okay for Commerce to say, actually, we don't want to work on that, right? Okay, now what we maybe should distinguish is sometimes there are things when we are going to say, hey, pay attention to this trend, like this goes to the discussion Stu and I were just having about, think about some of those critical components that are going to go to sole source in a country and how does that impact resilience? Okay, that might be a trend you want to pay attention to. Okay, but there might be things where rather than let us invest a lot more time and energy, it's like we can't go there, right? And so let's put our energy in the things that are important to commerce.
Makes sense.
It does, Willie, and we try to do that, but I think the caution is good to continue to push down that road of not barking up a tree that nobody's willing to really push forward for whatever reason. I think that one of the things that we have to make sure we do is vote on the recommendations, and we moved out of Stu's section without actually voting on his recommendation. And I think we have to do that. Right? So I'm going to kind of cycle back and have Stu go through each one. And I think the only people who can vote, give us, Richard, why don't you give me the laws, the rules of the road here so I don't do something wrong.
Hey, Ursula, thank you. Yeah, we have to individually, as the 5 recommendations, need to vote on each one, and only the ACSCC members are allowed to vote. Okay, so if we want to, you can bring up each one and like what Jeff has done in the past, each one have a vote on it, et cetera, on each one of those would be great. Thank you.
Right.
Tom, do you want to bring up that final slide and we just go back through it one more time, please?
And Gene, we'll do yours next. Got it. So go ahead, Stu, walk us through number 1.
So number 1, design, develop, manufacturing data platform. I know we've gotten approval from the subcommittee members. I will turn it over to the full committee members to vote.
We have all in favor, I guess is a standard move. Say yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Any nays? Great, so 1 is approved. Let's do the same thing for 2. It's on the slide, so all in favor.
IPF.
All in
Yes.
favor? Yes.
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 Anyone opposed? 3, all in favor?
Yes.
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 Opposed? 4 and 5, I'll do them together. No, I'll do 4. 4, all in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? And then 5, all in favor?
Yes.
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 So all of the recommendations as presented on the slides have been made and approved by the ACSCC membership.
Thank you, everybody, for your approval on all of these. I
Jason,
know
do
the
you
team
have your
members
hand up
appreciate it.
for something? You don't.
He's happy.
He's clapping.
Oh, he's clapping. Okay, great. Sorry.
And so now in moving back to Jean's subcommittee, are there new recommendations, Jean, from the freight subcommittee?
They've been pretty standardized, Jeff, with
Right.
respect to the investment, the labor workforce component, and the exports. We wanted to give our newly minted member Joe Gasparov some time to get up to speed and work with the colleagues. We'll be putting those subcommittee recommendations to vote and then returning them back to full committee in short order.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right. Are there any other discussion on the freight subcommittee's comments? Well, Jean, as always, thanks to you and the rest of the subcommittee for your well-organized work and passionate leadership. The work that you've done in the past on the recommendations was super clear, and I think in light of the last 10 minutes of discussion, the work now is to just continue to get feedback from the department and make sure that we whittle the list to the selection that's going to be the most effective.
Thanks, Jeff and Ursula.
Okay, let's move on to the manufacturing competitiveness subcommittee. Revathi?
Okay, I wish I had slides like Stu, but I don't, so I'm just gonna talk through mine. I have to say, I learned a few things today. Most important was what does BHAG stand for? So I didn't know that, so thank you, Stu. But okay, so we've been working on this for a while, the manufacturing subcommittee, and all these have been voted on before, so nothing different, I would say. So I'll just talk about 4 recommendations, and this is kind of dating back from the October meeting. We've been fairly consistent with these 4 recommendations. First was an effort led by David Ball, which was on public-private partnership to encourage employment of formerly incarcerated people. David Ball, I think, is not able to join us today, but research was done on 2 private sector programs, both based out of Kansas City, and then I think the committee believes that Commerce still has the opportunity to use its overall convening power to highlight that that the success of these programs and the firms like Second Chance are having makes this a very viable kind of partnership to continue to pursue. And so I think this recommendation still stands. I think more work needs to be done on it to see if Commerce wants to move it forward. The second one is for visa allocations on highly educated immigrant students in key advanced manufacturing fields. We've heard a lot of conversation about wanting to kind of start the semiconductor manufacturing restart or accelerate manufacturing process in the US, and the availability of good technical knowledge workers on all parts of the factory process and the manufacturing process has been difficult to do. So really focused on key advanced manufacturing fields, having a focused visa allocation process. I led this effort on behalf of the subcommittee. And earlier this year, the committee asked for data that we collected through an informal poll about companies that need H-1B visas who have announced fairly significant expansion of US manufacturing. That data was fairly revealing in terms of how much work that there is to be done in terms of getting the right skilled labor. And then going forward, the subcommittee just plans to continue to work directly with the Domestic Policy Council, to help them with their policy efforts and continue to explore additional avenues for this and get support for this. The third one was around leveraging FDA supply chain visibility to expand US resiliency. Dr. Brainard talked about this. Tom Poland led this effort on behalf of the manufacturing subcommittee. And this is a really intriguing one. It falls right in the area of the US government has amazing set of information on the products that are being used and developed in future technology, and supply chain for essential products, that is in the US medical products, is a continuing concern. We can, Secretary Raimondo mentioned about kind of the baby food shortage issue. And the pandemic continued to really expose more shortcomings in this, and we face a lot of gaps in terms of the key vulnerabilities in this area. So Tom and the BD team had a lot of productive discussions with Commerce and FDA, and agreed to convene a joint roundtable to examine a series of questions and raise awareness on this issue. So I think good conversations. We feel people are listening, and Tom will continue to lead this effort. The fourth one is one that Billy has been super passionate about, that he just mentioned again. And all of us should be passionate about this because it is a critical issue, and that is about using the National Defense Stockpile to create demand for new innovative process technologies. Particularly what we want to highlight here is associated with critical minerals. And the data on this is really amazing. Willie led this effort, and he can say more about this. But he's talked to a lot of organizations. Like everything Willie does, this was very thoroughly investigated with organizations in and out of the government. And the discussions on the Defense National Stockpile highlighted that the Strategic and Critical Materials Stockpiling Act, which exists as currently written, was really only designed to sustain DoD programs. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And barring legislation to change this charter, there'll be very limited flexibility to expand this outside of the role of that particular role of the organization. And then some of the findings, which I think is amazing, is that first is there's a lot of new opportunity on how we extract and refine critical minerals, a lot of new processes going into place. And this really gives an opportunity to be disruptive and for new suppliers to come on board and disrupt the incumbent and build a really more domestically focused supply chain on this. I think the other data point that is very revealing is that last year, Chinese companies doubled investment spending compared to the 25% increase on average for Western mining groups. So the view is that the US should be doing a lot more. And then investments in many of these technologies are hampered by the payback period. It's long-term horizon, right? Return is not very clear. There's a lot of transparency issues in terms of volatility on price of ores and minerals. So it's very, very hard for, for companies in the Western world to invest without really understanding the returns. Somehow foreign investors, and we know the history on this, are willing to take on these risks a lot more than US investors. And I think Willie's research indicates that there is not enough expertise in many of these areas compared to Australia and Canadian and Japanese firms. So our recommendation here was that Commerce should explore and revisit tax and investment incentives for critical materials, particularly for new process technology used in extraction and metal refining. And we've seen a lot of positive impact on the IRA, right? We're all hearing and seeing the push on domestic content, on solar, on batteries, on EVs. So we feel like it's really worth considering a tax policy to be used so that some of these areas can become more investable, that are going to be really important to the continued growth of the US economy. And then the last one, the fifth one, was read by Rainer Blair, and this was about protecting US leadership position in synthetic and industrial biology. And Monica Gorman talked about this. The Biden-Harris administration has announced a lot of initiatives on this since this time this recommendation was made. So we're quite happy with this, and this is very aligned with this effort. But we feel like effective implementation will require a lot more focus and effort to fund the relevant programs and drive a lot of public-private partnership. And the goal of the subcommittee is to continue to provide recommendations relative to this implementation and this initiative. So till October, the coming October, the subcommittee will continue to work on these initiatives to close these out and make sure that we can continue to provide relevant recommendations for the Commerce Department to use. In July, we had a really good meeting with Grant and Monica and rest of the team. It was a very productive meeting. It goes a little bit to Jean's conversation on how do you speed the dialogue and how do you access policymakers better, and how do you make sure these recommendations don't go stale, even if some of those recommendations are not utilized. And I think on those discussions, what we agreed was a lot of new US government priorities, like I talked about, like Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and then the Department of Commerce focus on increasing and creating the supply chain center of excellence that we really want to help with, focus on critical minerals that I talked about, and the NIST manufacturing extension partnership. So our goal is to provide more feedback on these initiatives that are already existing and ongoing, and and the department can use that feedback in whatever way they see fit. So we just want to say that a lot of work by our subcommittee staffers and the companies that participated. Of course, a lot of work by Willie. So really want to thank Grant, you and your team, and Secretary Raimondo and their staff for just listening. And it's exciting to see that some of these things are moving forward, and we were happy to participate in the process. So I will pause with that and see if there is any questions. And Jeff, as I said, all of these were voted on before, so I don't think needs to be done again.
Revathi, I thank you for the update, and to the subcommittee for all the hard work in fleshing these out. Again, going back to the list of priorities that the department has shared, the manufacturing extension partnerships in support of SMEs, is that something that is worth the manufacturing subcommittee spending some time on?
Yeah, Jeff, I think the agreement was, or at least a discussion with Grant and the team, was that we would look for feedback from all our companies regarding that particular initiative and provide that to the Commerce Department. But we definitely agree that that is one of them in the four that we were highlighting, because that just fits right into the arena of what the charter of the subcommittee was.
Yep.
That sounds great. And then the other question I had, again, trying to compare the list that we received with the things we're already working on, is because of all of the companies represented by direct membership in the subcommittee and their own supply chain networks, are there opportunities to provide the secretary with concrete examples of, for example, Indian opportunities to use Indian suppliers instead of Chinese suppliers for particular, for particular production problems? That's just one example, but there's so much awareness of the sort of worldwide capabilities represented on your team. I'm wondering if that's a role that we can play in support of the Commerce Department's objectives.
Yeah, I would say on India, the secretary had already reached out for very specific feedback on building supply chain. So I'm kind of working a little bit on recommendations on the electronic side. Doug McMillan from Walmart's doing the same from his side. So I think they're getting input from various business leaders on this, and we're doing our own to provide it. I would say on the IPEF side, it would be interesting to really participate on that. I think somebody had asked the question of what is the end-to-end supply chain capability of these IPEF countries? Which ones are better than others? And what are the best ways to maximize, the benefits coming out of IPEF? And I like the way it's loosely framed, so it provides more opportunity to create flexibility in how these agreements work. So I think that would be another one. I haven't been personally very engaged in it, and haven't gone out and asked the subcommittee for specific work on it. But I think as Grant and team comes back and asks for input on these initiatives, we'll go back and talk to the member companies on it. And Tom and Willie and any others who are on the phone, please feel free to jump in.
Did a great job summarizing, nothing to add.
Yeah, I think it was a great summary. I will note that, for pharma APIs, of course, India is a huge source, and also for generics. But then a lot of that tracks back to China via India as well, because I interviewed a couple of Indian manufacturers at the height of the pandemic, and they had gone from making their own APIs to sourcing from China just because of pricing pressure.
Interesting.
And we just have to be cognizant too, of course, there was a situation during COVID where even India became challenging from an API, right? It was chosen to keep API in India and not ship it to the US in certain categories, right? I believe. So that's just from which products, drugs, medical devices. There's probably a discussion we had and just an alignment from a national security perspective that there may be things in certain critical antibiotics and or medical devices like syringes, et cetera, that it's important for the US to have a position on that, like many other countries have, like Brazil, for example, is quite clear that they want that stuff domestically. They're not looking to even set up other partners on it, as an example. So, when it comes to healthcare, that's something that one should consider.
Yeah.
India and China have their own policies.
I should also add that was part of one of our recommendations on encouraging continuous flow manufacturing for pharma APIs and sterile injectables. That was one of the recommendations made in June of 2022 as well.
And a lot of good companies are doing work on it, Jeff, national resilience, as we talked about, and are really focused on those key APIs. So there is, good work going on it, but whether it's focused on kind of the right set of APIs and all of that, I think has to be taken forward more.
So
Thank you.
all of your recommendations have been voted on. So we have all 5 of them in record. There's 5,
Yep.
right?
That's right.
Good.
And I'm the last, so over to you and Jeff.
It's amazing that it's almost hard to believe that we're going to probably get through with this actually on time. Jeff, why don't you, I have nothing to say except for thank you to everyone, and it's still a lot of work to do, but really, really good progress.
Yeah, I would agree. And since we just wrapped up the manufacturing competitive subcommittee, thanks, Revati, and the whole subcommittee for your work. I also want to thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Giuliani, Assistant Secretary Harris, Secretary Raimondo, Director Bernard, Special Assistant Gorman, Undersecretary Farrell, Undersecretary Crane, and Councillor Wan for their insightful remarks and collaboration as we narrow down our focus. And thanks to all the members of the ACSCC, including our government partners. We've now come to the end of our scheduled agenda. our subcommittee's work over the next few months will focus on continuing to refine the recommendations. And as we discussed in the last half hour, working with the Department of Commerce to ensure that we have complete alignment in the priorities that they've chosen and the things we're doing to give them support, counsel, and data so that they can move even faster. Our next full committee meeting will take place in late October. For the first time since the reconstitution of this committee and since COVID, we will welcome members who are able to attend in person in Washington, D.C. That's the plan right now, is for an in-person meeting. If there are no other comments or questions, we are now adjourned. And thanks to all for your hard work.
Thank you all. In person, I don't even know if we know how to do that anymore.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.